Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. Merry Christmas and happy holidays, sunflowers. This is Nephilim VA bringing you a holiday special in the form of All for One's Christmas Carol, a one-shot written by the_numismatist on AO3. This classic tale in this anime alternative universe with some mentions of violence, death, and injury will take us on a journey to learn the meaning of Christmas. Let's do it together. With that being said, the summary of this one-shot is as followed. Christmas. A time of peace, love, and hope. For the symbol of evil, however, it was merely an excuse for citizens to celebrate, trying to ignore the looming threat of villains. However, when the ghost of his dead brother walks into his study, he is taken on a journey that will forever change him. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. All for One's Christmas Carol. Ah, Christmas, the most wonderful time of the year. A time when people the world over went around with smiles on their faces and Merry Christmas gracing their lips. Even those in countries that had little Christian influence still celebrated the holiday. It was a time of peace, joy, and love. A time when families could gather together, exchange presents, gorge themselves at dinner, and find solace in one another as the weather grew colder. In his study in an unknown location in Japan, the villain known as All for One sneered. Christmas, joy, peace, and goodwill to all men? It was an absurd notion. One he had no doubt the blonde buffoon would buy into wholeheartedly. Indeed, he had just been plastered all over the television dressed up as Father Christmas, delivering orphan puppies to sick children. Or sick puppies to orphan children, one of the two. He hadn't actually seen it, of course, having lost his eyes years ago to that man. But it didn't matter either way. The point was, Christmas was just the kind of holiday do-gooders love to promote, and it made All for One sick. Literally physically ill. As soon as December began, he broke out in hives that didn't abate until the new year. Sighing, he glanced around the large room. Normally, he would have been spending the evening in the Nomu lab with Dr. Garaki, or even watching over Tomura from afar. Unfortunately, thanks to the inconvenience that was Christmas Eve, the good doctor was spending the holiday with his family. And as for Tomura, he'd been trying to distance himself from the boy since the UA student's kidnapping and subsequent escape. It had become increasingly clear to All for One that he needed space to grow on his own as a villain, without the hand of a mentor. Still, that did rather leave him at a loss for what to do. He could scheme, he supposed, but alas, for now all of his schemes were on hold, at least until Tomura found his own way back to him, hopefully ready for war. It was a good plan. All for One never made any other kind. But it invoked an awful lot of waiting around. The last he had heard, his protege had taken command of the Meta Liberation Army. And wasn't that a blast from the past? He shook his head. No good would come from strolling down memory lane. Sighing once more, he took a glance at the bed in the corner of the room. He hadn't used it in years, decades even, not since he had acquired a quirk that turned such base needs into base suggestions. Still, he could enter a meditative trance that was akin to sleeping, with the added benefit of having his senses about him. It was a way to pass the time, if nothing else. Mind made up, he removed his suit jacket and dress shoes, used a quirk to remove the thick layer of dust that coated the bed, then lay down atop the covers and closed his eyes. He had lain there for barely a few hours when midnight came. Merry Christmas, he scoffed to himself before once more clearing his mind. Unfortunately, his attempts were thwarted by a rather rude intruder in his study. He did not hear them enter, but nevertheless felt their ice-cold presence watching him from across the room. Sighing, he sat up. All for One was a man who had lived for centuries. He had travelled far and wide and seen and experienced a many great things. He had thought there was little in the world that could surprise him anymore. So when he found he was able to truly see for the first time in 6 years, he was rather taken aback. Adding on to his surprise was the fact that the first thing he saw since regaining his sight was his brother. His very, very dead brother. He should know. He was the one to kill him. In death, Yoichi looked nearly identical to how he did in life, with long white hair and piercing green eyes. Now, however, his hair was floating above his head, and those eyes were regarding him coolly. With his semi-transparent body, he looked every bit the ghost he was. Yoichi, All for One uttered for the first time in centuries. His voice stuck in his throat. What more could he say? His brother continued to look over him for a moment before speaking. Daichi? Well, that removed any doubt as to his identity. All for One, he spat. Why? How? Quirks were strange. He would know better than anyone. But never had he heard of a quirk that could bring the spirits of the dead to life, let alone allow them to haunt their relatives. Yoichi simply sniffed and regarded him impassively, apparently unaware or uncaring of his undead status. I'm here because, despite everything you've done, I still believe there is hope for you, brother. Ah, there was the Yoichi he knew. All for One laughed. Hope for me? Dear brother, I see death hasn't made you any less sanctimonious. He scoffed and added, or naive. I am a villain. Some might even say the villain. You're wasting your afterlife. His younger brother continued to stare at him. He always knew how to be stubborn when he wanted to be. And yet, I do believe. You'll be visited by 3 others tonight. The first comes at 1. He cackled. Oh, brother, are you really pulling a Christmas carol on me? You're even more foolish than I'd believed. I'm afraid I'll have to decline, however. Apologies for making you come all this way. He sneered at the ghost and moved to lay back down. However, Yoichi whipped his hand forward and spectral chains shot out from the ether, binding All for One tight and forcing him to stare his brother directly in the eyes. Distantly, he recognized the sensation as being nearly identical to the 5th's quirk. It isn't optional, brother. You will see what we have to show you, and if you are wise, you will change your ways. All for One smirked. And if I refuse, will you perhaps show me the world without me, or maybe steal Christmas from me, or even better find an estranged son from the North Pole to teach me the true meaning of Christmas? He laughed in his brother's face, but he simply retained his stony expression. If you continue down this path, he began slowly with a dangerous edge, the 9th will stop you, and you will rot in Tartarus. He scoffed. I have no fear of the 9th. As it is, he was unable to even defeat Overhaul without assistance from a child. If that was the best option you had, I feel assured in my future, but okay, I'll play along. Bah! He exclaimed and mockingly added, Humbug! Yoichi sighed and turned away, releasing All for One from his bindings. The first comes at 1. Prepare. With those parting words and a chill in the air, Yoichi slowly faded into nothingness, leaving his older brother behind. The villain sighed, noting how he could still see normally. Perhaps it was a side effect of whatever had allowed his dead brother to manifest. Either way, the time seemed to race forwards, and 1 o'clock came quickly. All for One was resting in his chair when the hour came, and he rolled his eyes when the lights flicked off. It was time to see his past then. He waited in the darkness for a moment, and before long a faint glow shone through the window, and he watched as the spectral form of Shimura Nana floated into the room. He scoffed. "A fitting spirit for the past. Can't I convince you to give up this ridiculous charade?" The seventh regarded him with eyes devoid of emotion. She looked very much like she did in the prime of her life, strong and unyielding, floating in the air in the same way she did with her quirk. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," she said, voice far away and ethereal. "You were not always the way you are today. Though you have forgotten, the past is always present." All for One waved her off. Yes, very well, get on with it then." Nana floated forwards and grasped his arm tight, pulling him out of his chair like he weighed nothing. Together they floated out of the window and into the sky. She seemed fixed upon one star in particular, and as they approached it grew larger and brighter until the pure white light engulfed his vision. He had to admit, being blinded once more after regaining his vision was a rather unique annoyance. They continued soaring through the white space until they found themselves floating in the corner of a room he could only describe as painfully nostalgic. The light cream color of the walls, the large red rug covering the hardwood floor, and the tall fir tree, covered in tinsel and baubles, and with wrapped presents piled underneath. Looking around at the shelves and stacks of books and knickknacks only confirmed that this was indeed his childhood home. Despite himself, he felt a wave of unknown emotion rise in his chest, one he quickly squashed down. He was broken out of his thoughts by the sound of footsteps hurrying down the stairs, and 2 dark-haired children burst into the room. He recognized them instantly, of course he did. One was him, after all. Judging by how the boy looked, he was around 5 years old. Then this was the year he gained his quirk. Yoichi trailed behind him, scrambling to keep up even as he choked on the air, coughing and hacking in a way that made All for One wince slightly. If Daichi was 5, then tragedy was just around the corner. Memories of hospital visits and endless blood tests flashed through his mind. "Come on, Yoichi!" his younger self shouted. "It's Christmas!" Yoichi wheezed and tried to keep up, but found himself falling short. Slow down, Daini. You're faster than me." Daichi turned and rolled his eyes, but walked back and offered a hand to his younger brother anyway, one Yoichi gladly took. The 2 smiled at each other and ran off, and All for One had to hold himself back from following them. Nana turned to him, a meaningful look in her gaze. "You think you can reform me with mawkish childhood sentimentality?" He barked a short laugh. "That's cute," he sneered. "But really you have to do better than that." The dead woman shrugged slowly. "You have a long history, All for One, and I have time." He rolled his eyes as the bright white light enveloped them both. When he regained his vision, he found some years had passed. No longer did they stand in his childhood home. but now in a run-down old apartment of his early childhood. Before them, on a beat-up sofa staring at the television that only worked half the time, sat two young men. One was painfully thin, with bright green intelligent eyes and ragged hair, white not from dye or age, but from sickness. Next to him, almost in contrast, sat a broad-shouldered man with large hands, currently crossed over his lap, blood-red eyes, a side effect of a quirk he had been offered, and short white hair, dyed in sympathy for his brother. The two were watching the television with a deep sense of apprehension, and all for one knew what this day was. The day everything changed. And in other news, the Diet has announced that they are cracking down on citizens with meta abilities. Starting on the 1st of January, all metahumans will be required to register with the government by the end of the month. Failure to do so will result in a fine or possibly a prison sentence. While no further plans have been announced, there have been suggestions that metahumans will later be required to attend public safety training camps to ensure that no harm comes to the general populace. The TV flicked off, and Daichi ran a calloused hand through his hair. "That's it then. Public massacres, and we're the ones who get punished." All for One remembered it well. Barely 2 weeks before that day, a meta-ability research center had been the target of a bombing, killing 10 people and wounding many more. Tensions between metas and normals had been steadily growing since before he was born, but this was where they reached their boiling point. "Perhaps it won't be so bad," Yoichi offered weakly, though even he knew he was wrong. Sighing, the younger brother looked down at his hands. "So, you're joining them then?" Daichi nodded. "It's the only way I can be safe. Ito, Madorame, they can protect me better than if I just wait here. I have to do something, Yoichi." He turned to his brother. "I'll keep in contact as much as I can. I'm sorry." Yoichi shook his head. "Don't be. If the government got their hands on your ability..." He didn't need to finish. The implication had been hanging over their heads for years. Besides, where you go, I go. "But it's dangerous. In your state..." Daichi began to protest, but was cut off by his brother. "My state is fine for now. Besides, this is more important. It's bigger than us. Any of us." Yoichi's face was set in a stern line, brooking no argument, and his older brother relented. All for One watched the scene with growing melancholy. "I should have held firm. If he hadn't joined..." "You would still have given him stockpile. Nothing would have changed." Nana's voice was even, stern. "Are you the ghost of alternative timelines now?" He snapped back, though there was little heat behind it. Sighing, he looked at the scene before him, a memory frozen in time. "They say the course of history can be changed with a few simple words. You understand the butterfly effect, I'm sure. Still, I wonder. If I had made a different decision here, chose to run or hide instead of fight, how much would have changed? Would the quirked still be as oppressed as they are, even as their numbers grew? Or would the revolution have found another leader? Perhaps Destro would never have founded the Meta Liberation Front if we had not paved the way. Or perhaps nothing would have changed, save for my own situation. I wonder what a world like that would look like." Nana's soft, stern voice broke him out of his musings. "The past is etched in stone. It cannot be changed. We can only accept it." He hummed. "You know, you were never like this when you were alive." She fixed him with a stony glare. I had a lot of time to reflect after you killed me. All for One shrugged as the light once more engulfed them. This time, however, they were not brought to another residence, but to an all-too-familiar hospital room. It was as dark and slapdash as the rest of the Resistance's base, and All for One's stomach dropped as he saw his brother lying in bed, skinnier and weaker than ever. He seemed near death, and his chest barely rose as he slumbered. Daichi was kneeling next to the bed, clutching his brother's hand and sobbing silently.
You can't go, Yoichi. I need you. You're the best of me.
All for One tried to look away, but his gaze was firmly fixed on the scene before him. His younger self rose on shaking legs, hand outstretched. The memory seemed to play in slow motion, and he found himself subconsciously reaching out to the younger man, trying to do something. What, he didn't know. Stop him? Warn him about the path ahead? It didn't matter. He could do nothing but watch as Daichi placed his hand on his brother's face and forced a quirk into him, sealing his fate. Huffing a bitter laugh, he finally turned away.
Showing me my greatest mistakes, Seventh? You're more vindictive than I thought.
Was this a mistake? She challenged. One for All has been a priceless tool in the fight against villainy. Its wielders have inspired hope, maintained peace.
Been a persistent thorn in my side, he finished.
She nodded. Villains like you are the reason we fought. If it were up to me, I would have gutted you for what you've done to my family, but Ninth, well, Toshi really knows how to pick 'em. He smirked, regaining some of his strength.
So this was the Midoriya boy's plan. Excellent, I can't wait to see how I can break it.
Nana rolled her eyes, and the light enveloped them once more. Their arrival at their next destination was met with a loud cheer, and for a moment, All for One forgot his lack of physical presence, startling slightly at the sudden noise. Nana smirked at him, and he returned with a scowl before turning back to the room in front of him. They stood to one side in a large room, where familiar, long-dead faces chatted happily with drinks in hand. Daichi was standing at the front of the room, engaged in an animated conversation with a man with a chestnut ponytail who wore a domino mask. Leaning against the wall alone, Yoichi smiled, content yet tinged with some strange sadness. A vice-like grip slowly clenched over All for One's heart.
We don't need to see this. I remember this moment all too well. Take me away.
Nana simply raised an eyebrow at him. The great All for One scared of a few ghosts? He growled at her and resolved not to look. He tried to turn away, but no matter which direction he went in, he seemed to keep staring at his younger self. He tried to close his eyes, but it was as though his eyelids were glass, as he could see through them perfectly. For the first time in his life, he longed for the blindness inflicted upon him by the star-spangled oath. Someone coughed into the microphone at the front, and the room slowly grew quiet. Daichi cleared his throat and began to speak.
Thank you all for coming. I'm not one for speeches, so I'll keep this brief.
He smirked slightly, and a wave of laughter rippled through the room.
For years, each and every one of us has fought against the oppression of metahumans. We have struggled under the most terrible tragedies and violence inflicted upon us by an uncaring population, all while the government turned a blind eye. We have lost many along the way.
The atmosphere sobered, and All for One himself couldn't help but allow himself a moment to remember the dead.
But no more! Between the Metahumans' Rights Alliance and Yotsubashi-san's Meta-Liberation Army, he gestured to the masked man, who nodded solemnly. Today we have won a great victory.
Technically, it had been a few days ago, but Daichi loved an excuse to party. With the government announcing revolutionary anti-meta-discrimination laws, they had finally gained the acceptance they had worked so hard for. From there, time seemed to move so fast, yet slowed to a crawl. Before long, the room was empty, save for Daichi and his brother. The two sat side by side, chatting quietly.
You know, this is just the beginning for us.
His brother hummed inquisitively, prompting him to follow up with,
Yotsubashi-san's ideology really is something. A truly free society, with no limits. How does that sound?
Yoichi considered it for a moment. Dangerous. You've seen how powerful these abilities can be. Allowing unrestricted use is asking for trouble.
Daichi rolled his eyes. There you go again. If I didn't know any better, I'd say you wanted us to be controlled.
All for One winced as Yoichi glared at his younger self. Why did he say that? He was a man of few regrets, but this was one of them. If he hadn't been so careless with his words, allowed the stress to get to him, perhaps his brother wouldn't have died cursing his name. You know it's not like that, Nisan. I just want what's best for everyone. You remember the Todoroki incident, right?
Daichi scoffed. One person losing control doesn't mean everyone should be punished. If I were in charge, I could easily have taken the power from him and given it to someone who deserves it.
The atmosphere turned frosty as Yoichi scowled. Even if they didn't want it? The question was met with silence, as the scene was once again consumed by light. The twinge of regret did not fade with it, however. It only grew, until All for One could do nothing but roll the words over and over in his mind. What he had suggested. That was exactly what they were fighting against. He had been a young man, foolish and arrogant. Perhaps he never grew out of that. That moment wasn't when they finally broke apart. No, that came much later. But it was the beginning of the end. The first crack before the dam broke. The first drop of rain before the storm. And when the time finally came, the scene faded in, one forever etched into his memory. He and his brother at opposite ends of an empty street, staring each other down. How had they come to this? He wasn't even sure where he went off the rails looking back. At some point his goals had shifted, from equal rights to liberation to supremacy. It had been years by this point, and he had begun his centuries-long campaign for domination. But what was it all for? Had it been worth the losses? Yoichi was shaking, struggling to hold himself up. Daichi looked upon him, sorrow passing his face before quickly being replaced by fury.
You can't win, Yoichi. Give up. Come back to me. And we can forget all about this silly rebellion.
The younger brother looked up at him, face a mask of determination, and assumed a fighting position. Perhaps I can't, but neither can you, not as long as the spirit of goodness still lives on. Daichi rolled his eyes.
What are you talking about, brother? There is only you here, not your boyfriend or his lackey, no one except you. You are alone.
Yoichi shook his head, and had the nerve to smile. That's where you're wrong. You see, It turns out I wasn't baseline after all. The elder scoffed.
I would have known if you were a meta, Yoichi.
He shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. You remember that ability you forced onto me? It bonded with whatever I had inside me. I've already passed it on. Daichi scowled.
Whatever. It never did much good, did it now?
His arms burst through the sleeves of his suit as his muscles bulged out.
Are you going to come quietly?
His brother spat on the ground. Never. The two launched themselves at one another, hit after hit and punch after punch, colliding into each other. It was nothing like the clashes All for One would later have in his life, but it was enough to kick dust into the air, making it difficult to see what was going on. He heard the scream well enough. The dust soon settled, and he watched as his younger brother collapsed to his knees, his chest a bloody mess. Daichi stood over him, pity written across his face.
You could have prevented this, brother. All you had to do was join me.
Yoichi looked up at him, eyes alight with rebellion, even as he choked on his own blood.
Never. You've already lost. All for one.
With those parting words, the light faded from his younger brother's eyes, and the world faded to black, leaving All for One and Nana floating in a void. It wasn't the first time he had revisited that day. No, it was a common feature in his dreams. Still, he rarely saw it as vividly as he just had, and, just for a moment, he found himself wondering, was I wrong? He hardened his heart immediately, though. No, he couldn't have been wrong. If he was, then... Shimura Tenko, the Nomu, everything. It all would have been in vain. All this time he had promised himself that if he could just succeed, if he could rule, then it all would have been worth it. He tried not to think about the alternative.
It is regretful the way that things turned out,
he began, trying to put his villain persona back on. However, it was like an old suit, worn out and beginning to no longer fit him.
However, it was his choice to go against me. Perhaps this would serve as a lesson.
Nana stared at him. She could see through his front. He was an open book to her. However, silently, she grasped his arm tight and once more flew off into the darkness. They flew past endless battles, thousands upon thousands of bodies that paved All for One's path. He saw himself choking the life out of the second, then caving in the third skull. He witnessed as his past self burst through the door to the fourth's cabin, only to watch him pass away with a triumphant smile. The fifth, garroted with his own quirk. The sixth, pounded into the ground, body broken. Nana's face was carefully neutral as they watched him hurl her through buildings before gutting her. And then finally... they watched as the eighth destroyed All for One, even as his own organs threatened to spill out. They saw the victory pose he took as a new dawn rose. All for One's mouth tasted like sandpaper. The scenes faded away, and they found themselves once more in his study. Nana's form was fading fast now, and the clock on the wall confirmed that their time together was at an end. My work is almost done. All for One, you have seen the echoes of your past. Reflect on them, see where they have taken you, and repent. Before he could reply, she had already disappeared. He sighed and collapsed into his chair, Feeling as though he had aged 100 more years, he willed his mind not to review what he had seen, but he could not help himself as images of the past flew unbidden into his mind. His heart squeezed tightly and he scowled.
Repent. Pathetic. I am all for one. The world trembles at my feet. I have everything I could ever want.
Are you sure about that? Despite having over 2 centuries worth of situational awareness, All for One jumped in his seat. Slowly he turned towards the door. Poking his head round the door, stupid grin on his face, was the blonde buffoon himself. He growled,
So your Christmas present, then? I suppose that makes sense.
All Might continued to grin as he made his way into the room. Right you are! I, the ghost of Christmas present, am here to show you... He raised an eyebrow.
The present?
The hero faltered. Well, yes. Your days of villainy are over, All for One. He scoffed.
Now where have I heard that before? Ah, yes, right before you caved my skull in. Forgive me if I'm not too eager for a repeat.
The oaf merely laughed and took his arm. Nonsense! There will be no fighting tonight. It is Christmas after all.
You know crime and villainy rates skyrocket during the holidays.
All Might didn't respond, instead dragging him through the door. He went begrudgingly, knowing there was little he could do to stop him. As they walked out, he was hit by a sudden gust of freezing cold air. Looking around, they had walked not into All for One's hallway, but out into a quiet suburb in Musatafu. The buffoon cleared his throat and began to walk towards an unassuming family home. Come along, All for One! Our first stop is here! Rolling his eyes, the villain followed, somewhat confused about where they were and why. No one special lived there after all, but he indulged his mortal enemy, trailing behind him to the window of the house. The blonde said nothing as he gestured for him to look inside. Peering through the window, he was surprised to see his own underling, Dr. Garaki Kyudai, sitting at the head of a large dining table, around which sat many others old and young. Every single one of them was eating, drinking, and laughing. Most of all, the doctor. All for One was suddenly struck by the knowledge that he had never seen the doctor truly laugh. The doctor and his family! Being alive for that long really does lead to a lot of grandchildren. All Might laughed, loud and booming, yet the family inside took no notice of him, continuing their festive feast. The doctor chuckled at something one of his children said and took a sip of wine. Such a domestic scene normally would have sickened All for One to his stomach, but he couldn't help thinking about the Christmases he and Yoichi had spent with their extended family. Their mother was American, so it always was a big deal in their household. Distant memories of tables laden with food, presents piled under the tree, and even songs around the fire all flooded back to him, and he felt strangely full, yet emptier than ever. When was the last time he had truly spent time with someone, without expecting a service from them? Sure, he spoke to Garaki, Tomura, and Kodagiri frequently, but that was always part of his larger plans. When had he simply allowed himself to enjoy someone else's company, without an ulterior motive? He didn't know. A large hand fell on his shoulder. Family is truly beautiful, isn't it? While I can't say much for my parents, Nana and Torino more than made up for them, and Midoriya Shonen. Ah, the son I never had. He gave a wistful sigh that turned into a choked cough. The hero covered his mouth briefly before returning to his trademarked grin. Was that a spot of crimson by his mouth?
Well, so much to see!
Whatever brief fit the other man seemed to have soon passed, and he gestured towards the other side of the street before leading the way over himself. As All for One followed, thoughts turning over in his mind, he felt a strange pulling sensation when passing through the middle of the street. It went quickly, and he found himself in an altogether different place. A rather more familiar place. On a rundown street in an unassuming area of Kabukicho sat a small apartment block. He and All Might stood before the door to the 5th apartment on the 3rd floor, though the buffoon quickly led him through the door without opening it. Inside was mayhem. Tomura and his lizard minion, Spiker, were playing one of their infernal playbox games and yelling at one another, while the eldest Todoroki watched, slumped in an armchair. The blonde one and the black and grey masked one were taking it in turns to bother the magician, who was attempting to sleep at a table by the side. It was pure chaos. It felt like home.
You could say the League are a family of their own, I suppose. Certainly they seem to be enjoying themselves.
Another great booming laugh that didn't even bother All for One this time. No, he was far too caught up in his own tangled thoughts. More memories came back to him of days playing with Yoichi as children. It had been so long since he had any sort of sibling. He had forgotten the joy they could bring.
Perhaps not the most traditional family, of course, but whoever said family had to mean blood relations?
He laughed again before launching into another coughing fit, one that sounded rougher and harsher than before. All for One stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do. There were definitely droplets of blood this time. Was this because of him? It made sense, of course. He had all but eviscerated the man. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, being confronted with his own actions... Why did he feel guilty? The fit eventually passed, and All Might slowly rose to his full height. The two stood there in silence, mostly content to watch the League play around. Honestly, he had thought they would already have moved out. The new Meta Liberation Army had far better facilities than this run-down apartment. Perhaps, though, they were waiting for something or other. Either way, it made him feel strangely nice. It was an uncomfortable feeling rising in his chest. The buffoon cleared his voice and spoke in a surprisingly soft voice.
"We have another visit to make. Come onwards."
He turned and walked back through the door. All for One hesitated a moment, looking over the chaotic yet oddly comfortable scene before him once more, before turning and following. The scene that greeted him when he passed through the door was one that he never expected to see. Children he recognized as UA's Class 1A were lounging around a large living room, chatting animatedly as they exchanged random gifts. To one side stood Eraserhead and, surprisingly, the Wild Wild Pussycats. Inside him, Search seemed to strain against his hold as he saw its former owner.
"You brought me to UA. You're more foolish than I expected."
He half-heartedly snarked. He had a reputation to keep up after all. All Might chuckled.
"You can't do anything in this form, All for One. Besides, I have faith you'll soon change your mind."
He rolled his eyes.
"And why do you say that?"
Infuriatingly, he merely smiled and pointed towards one side. There, All for One saw a very familiar head of green hair. Midoriya Izuku, the 9th. The one destined to finally put an end to him, if his brother had his way. He was wearing a ridiculous Christmas hat, and was sitting between two younger children. On his left sat a young boy with spiky black hair and a red cap with gold horns, while on the right sat a young girl in a Santa dress, with a singular horn peeking out from her light blue hair. Both looked up at him with similar expressions of awe, and All for One felt a unique pain in his gut. He remembered how Yoichi used to look at him like that, as if he hung the stars himself. The Midoriya boy continued chatting happily away to the children, unaware of the crisis he was currently causing in his fated enemy.
"Oh, Yoichi," he muttered to himself. "What have I done?"
His brother, the light of his life, the better part of him, the only one who could ever keep him on the straight and narrow, had died, all because of his own stupid ego. An ugly feeling rose in his chest once more, and this time, he didn't quite have the heart to push it down. The only thing that pulled him out of his thoughts was the sound of a hacking, wheezing, rattling cough from behind him. As he turned around, the scene around him faded to black, leaving only him and All Might on his knees in an empty void. The blonde buffoon collapsed to the floor, sounding more like he was choking than coughing. Suddenly, with a burst of steam, his large form was replaced by a polar opposite, a skinny, skeletal man, bones jutting out from his skin. He looked up at All for One, blue eyes still blazing with that same intensity.
"Remember your connections, All for One,"
he warned, gnarling finger pointing shakily at him.
"Repent for your crimes. Or else."
With those ominous words, the skeletal All Might faded into nothingness, leaving All for One alone once more. He expected to return to his study once again, but the void remains. The wind picked up, flying into him from some unknown source, and he pulled his suit jacket tighter around his body. Why weren't his quirks working? He had never felt so alone. The snow began to fall thick and fast, getting picked up by the wind and flying around him until all he could see was an endless blizzard. All for One held himself tight, squinting against the snowstorm. He had never felt so... How could he describe this feeling of utter isolation, of the bitter cold that bit into his fingers and sent daggers of ice straight through him? He stepped forwards, placing one trudging footstep after the other, fighting against the howling winds. A tingle went up his spine, but not from cold. He whipped around and found he was no longer alone. Standing a few feet away was Midoriya Izuku, wearing a forest green suit that could only have been a hero costume. The ninth did not seem to be fazed by the weather conditions, and simply stared at All for One, the boy's eyes piercing his very soul. Despite everything, he mustered up the last scraps of his courage and smirked.
"You're the ghost of Christmas yet to come, I take it. Fitting. Well, your mentor already tried his worst. I'm sure you won't even measure up to that."
The boy showed no signs of hearing him, simply continuing to stare impassively. All for One scowled.
"Well then, if you won't make any attempt at civil conversation, I suppose I'll just have to leave you here. Goodbye, Ninth. Pray you die before we meet on the battlefield. It'll be a quicker death."
With that, he turned away, only to nearly walk straight into Midoriya. He growled. The blizzard must have disoriented him. He turned away again, but found the boy continuing to stare straight at him. Indeed, no matter where he turned, it seemed that Midoriya Izuku would always be in front of him. Symbolic, perhaps, but annoying nevertheless.
"What do you want, Ninth? You clearly won't let me go until you're through with me, so get on with it."
Midoriya continued to stare for a moment, before slowly lifting his arm and with a flick of his wrist, dismissed the blizzard. As the storm pulled away from them, the void was replaced by a cold, pure white room. Along one wall was a large window, behind which sat 2 empty chairs. A basic toilet and shower were partitioned off from the rest of the room, and a small bed with thin sheets rested in the corner. Atop it sat Tomura, looking older and more tired. His pinky fingers were encased in small blocks of metal, and he stared at the bare ground. With a glance back at the ever-silent Midoriya, All for One took a slow step towards his ward. He could easily guess what had happened here. Tomura's plans had failed, and he had been imprisoned. Closer now, he could just make out the breathy mumbles he had grown so used to over the years. He couldn't hear what the boy was saying yet, but he was clearly angry. Slowly, Tomura brought a hand up to his neck and began to scratch. His mutterings grew louder too, allowing him to make out such phrases as, "How dare he betray me?" and "I trusted him."
It seems one of his league might not be as loyal as he thought. I'll have to rectify that later.
Midoriya gave no response, and he rolled his eyes. In front of him, Tomura's scratching grew faster, his muttering grew louder and louder, until he shot to his feet and screamed,
"Sensei, why did you abandon me?"
All for One was taken aback, but before he could process Tomura's sudden outburst, the blizzard swept back in, enveloping him in darkness once more. After a moment, it receded, revealing a desolate wasteland. The landscape was bare, and the dry, cracked earth stretched off in every direction. It was a completely barren desert, save for 2 figures off in the distance. He ran towards them, desperate for a sign of life in this empty world. When he got nearer, he faltered. Standing, panting deeply, costume torn and bloodied, was Midoriya Izuku. He had clearly grown up a little, maybe his 2nd or 3rd year, but seemed to have changed significantly. His outfit was darker, his gloves had bloodied brass knuckles. His eyes, however... All for One had seen many people in his life. Many of those people had been through times of war. Some had even fought on the front lines. Midoriya Izuku had the eyes of a soldier, one who had seen far too much, and would never recover. Lying in front of him was the bloody, broken body of All for One. The future villain was lying still, but his mouth was still moving, and he could barely just make out the words he was croaking.
Look at the world around you, Ninth. See what it was all for.
With a rattling, gasping breath, All for One died, sneer on his lips. In front of him, the Ninth stared at his hands and collapsed to his knees, before letting out a deep, primal, guttural scream filled with layers upon layers of pain, anguish, and despair. The sound chilled All for One to the bone, and he collapsed to his knees as well, surrounded by the fruits of 2 centuries of work, a barren, desolate wasteland. So this was it then. Yoichi's death, every person he had killed, the Nomu he had created. It was all for this. Dust. He stared into the distance, praying for some sign of life other than the sobbing Ninth, but none came. All his efforts. He laughed, bitter and mirthless.
It was all for nothing then. Futile. I killed my brother, destroyed every relationship I had. And what did I get for it?
He gestured to the lone sands before him, not caring as tears began to roll down his cheeks.
Dust. Ash. Nothing of value.
He turned to the younger Midoriya, who watched the sands with an inscrutable expression.
I can still change, can't I? There's still time?
When no response came, he collapsed into Dogaza.
Please, I can still change.
He sobbed, uncaring of whatever reputation he had left.
I'll do anything to make amends.
He glanced up through watery eyes, only to see Midoriya regarding him neutrally. The wind began to pick up, and he felt a chill as the blizzard began to swirl around them once more. Without a word, Midoriya turned around and walked off into the snow. All for One sobbed on the ground as the snows enveloped him in an icy white embrace. Gasping, Shigaraki Daichi awoke to sunlight streaming in through his window. His vision was back to its usual infrared, but he could feel the cold warmth on his face.
I made it. It's Christmas Day!
He jumped out of bed, moving faster than he ever thought he would at the idea of the holiday. He laughed, feeling lighter than he ever had, before gasping, I have so much to do, so many calls to make. I've no time to waste. Izuku awoke on Christmas morning lying on one of Class 1A's sofas. He felt exhausted, and every muscle in his body screamed as he shifted around. He supposed that it was his fault for essentially getting a little over 2 hours of sleep the previous night. Still, he felt reasonably confident they'd achieved their goal. Sitting up slowly, he realized he wasn't alone in the room. On the contrary, in fact, spread out amongst the sofas and armchairs, and even sitting on the floor, was the entirety of the first-year heroics course, along with Aizawa-sensei, with Nezu-sensei on his shoulder, and All Might, currently in his skinny form. Every single eye in the room was fixed on the television at the front, and when he looked, Izuku could see why. On the screen, All for One stood behind a podium, destroyed face in full view of the camera.
I am sure very few of you know me, but my name is Shigaraki Daichi, formerly known as All for One, the symbol of evil and benefactor of the League of Villains.
A gasp rolled through the room, but Izuku locked eyes with All Might and Nezu-sensei. They each knew of the events of the previous night and were just hoping their efforts were not in vain. However,
I say formally because I have come to a realization. I no longer wish to be a villain. My path was always to fight for the rights of the oppressed, but somewhere, somehow, I have lost my way. I have caused irreparable harm to so many people, and for that, I can only apologize.
Another wave of gasps, and Izuku smiled softly to All Might. The man smiled back, and deep within the recesses of his quirk, he could feel a warmth emanating from his core, enveloping him in what felt like a warm hug. He smiled to himself and turned back to the television.
My quirk, All for One, allowed me to steal quirks and force them into others. No more. I will only take quirks offered to me, and I will only give them to those who ask. Furthermore, if I have ever stolen a quirk from you, I would like to offer it back to you. Simply contact Mera Yokomiru at the Hero Commission for more details. With that said, I believe I am about to be transported to Tartarus. Thank you for your time, and Merry Christmas.
With that, the television clicked off, before returning to a very confused newsroom moments later. Instantly, the air was filled with the sound of dozens of hero students shouting questions. Izuku himself was content to simply sit back in his chair and smile. Merry Christmas indeed. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. All credits goes to the original creator of this fanfiction, _numismatist on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Today we found out the meaning of Christmas, and we did find that the true meaning of Christmas is to leave the villain life behind. I am happy you gathered to listen to me read, and I am here for you whenever you need. Before I leave you to enjoy your holiday, there is one more thing I must say. Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!